Welcome to episode 145 of the Lucretius Today podcast. Over the last 3 years, we've had a format where we've generally read a text at the beginning of the podcast, and we're going to deviate from that format as we produce a general introduction to the philosophy of Epicurus for the generalist listener, the generalist reader who's not a professional philosopher, who doesn't necessarily have a lot of background about Greek philosophy in general or Epicurus in particular. And we're going to do that not by reading through, but by following the organizational plan that was used by Professor Norman DeWitt in his book, Epicurus and His Philosophy, which is a book that was released in 1954 by the University of Minnesota Press in Minneapolis. And we'll talk today a little bit about who Norman DeWitt was and the purpose of his book, what he set out to do in writing it. And we'll go through his chapter 1, which he's entitled The Synoptic View of Epicureanism. And we'll try to present a general overview of Epicurean philosophy and why it's of interest and the best way to approach it if they're not a professional philosopher. Our podcasts have never been oriented towards professional philosophers. We've tried to employ those as much as we could, but people who come to the Epicurean Friends Forum, that most of us are not professional philosophers. We have not devoted our lives to the study of philosophy, and that is particularly a problem in attempting to just jump into it for the first time. One of the things we talk about is that if a general reader just goes to the Wikipedia page on Epicurus and reads some of the main topics there, that you're likely to get a very insufficient picture of the philosophy as a whole. So that's what we're going to do today and for the next several episodes is use the Epicurus and His Philosophy book to attempt to provide a more general perspective on Epicurus's role in Western philosophy and how it might continue to be of relevance to us today. So with that as background, there are several statements in the preface which we should mention before we get too far into this. And one of the things is an aspect of this book that sometimes leads to criticism, and that is that at the very opening of the book, Norman DeWitt says that he had 3 purposes in writing his book. The first was to organize the surviving data on the life of Epicurus into a consequential biographical sketch and throw some light upon the growth of his personality and the development of his philosophy. And the second is to present a new interpretation of his doctrines based on less amended, less revised remains of his writings. And third, this is the one that causes some trouble sometimes, to win attention for the importance of Epicureanism as a bridge of transition from the classical philosophies of Greece to the Christian religion. And so one of the things we do see in this book as we read through it is that DeWitt has a tendency to put more emphasis than probably most of us would on what he sees as potential connections between Christianity and Epicureanism. It's certainly well known among most Christians that of all the philosophies at the time of the New Testament, the Epicureans and the Stoics are, I think, the only ones who are actually mentioned in the Bible. There's a famous passage that I doubt I could quote, Acts 17. There'll be instances like Christianity, references to people like Thomas Jefferson, references to all sorts of other scholars that will prove to be of use and of interest and give us topics for discussion with people who are interested in certain things and who would find these details to be of interest and perhaps lead them into a closer study of Epicurus. But as far as the goal of this podcast, it's not to build bridges between Epicureanism and Christianity. On the other hand, it is important to know the background in which the philosophy developed. And although it certainly did not develop with Christianity, it predates Christianity by 250 years or more. It developed in a philosophical context of its own that was very important to understand. Most of us today have very little understanding of the Greek civilization or the background of Greek philosophy. And as new generations come up and the history of Greek philosophy gets demoted further and further from most education curriculum, we're going to find that more and more people have less and less background in this time period. So hopefully we can provide some of that background for generalist readers of Epicurus. The very first thing that DeWitt chooses to stress in chapter 1 that I think is significant for us to discuss is the second sentence of chapter 1. At the very outset, the reader should be prepared to think of him, Epicurus, at one and the same time as the most revered and the most reviled of all founders of thought in the Greco-Roman world. And that's something that bears some discussion here because the material that people will read today about Epicurus comes to us either from people who like Epicurus a lot or who basically hated him and who had lots of reasons to distort his philosophy, misrepresent what he said, and make him look bad. So let's talk about this contention that Epicurus was one of the most revered and at the same time most reviled of the founders of a Greco-Roman philosophical school.
Well, you articulated the second part of that, but you haven't really explained the first part yet, and that was that he was the most revered of all founders of thought in the Greco-Roman world. And what DeWitt will go in detail here to explain is how, I shouldn't say detail, it's more of an overview. He goes on to explain how Epicureanism spread in the ancient world, how long it lasted, which was for about 7 centuries, and flourished in Greece, Asia Minor, Syria, Judea, Egypt, Italy, Roman Africa, and Gaul. And Cicero, who is one of the many later commentators who reviled Epicurus in many ways, actually makes our point in this case for us when he complains about how Epicurus is scooping people up at the crossroads. So you've got this issue where many people are actually on board with a lot of what he's saying. They've been surrounded by early efforts at philosophy culturally for their whole lives, but so much of it has sounded to them like just dense, inane speculation about things that really don't matter to people in their everyday lives. And so the more pragmatic people are and the more devoted they are to their own life and their families and what they're going to do day to day, they're not going to find very much utility in Plato and his ideal forms. It's just not to be expected that they would. So Epicurus comes along in this context and begins to articulate a very different vision for what philosophy is and how it should be lived, not just in the academy or in the symposium or in the gymnasium, but in our homes and on the street and when we go to work every day. And so it is, I think, a very different approach to philosophy that Epicurus is presenting here. And it's because it's that different approach that he manages to expand the interest in his philosophy, not just to all corners of the known world, but to all social classes and conditions. And that was something I don't think you had ever seen before. And it's probably on that basis that DeWitt makes the claim about the bridge between classical philosophy, the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle and the pre-Socratics, between that group of individuals and Epicurus, and sort of mirrors the way in which maybe the religions of the time, which were the provinces of the priests or the various religious councils, and where the people were just expected to show up at the temple and do their sacrifices and hand over their money. The connection there, I think, is between what Epicurus was doing with philosophy and what the Christians were doing with religion. That's the connection, which I won't say too much more about. And then, of course, as you say, he was thoroughly reviled. And that part hasn't stopped. That's still going on. You've got Maimonides expresses it as a Jewish scholar, and various Jewish scholars began to apply the word epikuros to heretics or non-believers. This is simply a translation or transliteration of Epicurus's name into Hebrew, Epikuros, Epicurus. So it gets to a point where Epicurus's name becomes sort of a byword for everything that these people see as being wrong or grossly immoral or simply ill-founded. And for that reason, he was reviled. Now, what's really interesting about this, and this is how DeWitt chooses to start his book, is that it creates an interesting dilemma for people, because we know that Epicurus and his philosophy for learned people in the ancient world, people in higher social classes, was essentially fruit from a poison tree. And yet there were many things in it that were alluring to people who were not Epicureans. And so DeWitt will go on to make the corollary point, which is that Epicurus was anonymous when he was actually supported or when people found something useful or beautiful in his philosophy, but he was generally named when he was condemned. And that's something that you'll see all the way through into modernity, unfortunately.
You know, Joshua, what you just said, one of the things we have on the front of the Epicurean Friends Forum is the statement of Lucian of Samosata out of Alexander the Oracle Monger. And the last sentence of that article was, My object, dear friend, in making this small selection from a great mass of material has been twofold. First, I was willing to oblige a friend and a comrade. But secondly, I was still more concerned to strike a blow for Epicurus, that great man whose holiness and divinity of nature were not shams, who alone had and imparted true insight into the good, and who brought deliverance to all that consorted with him. And that's the kind of very strong praise that supporters of Epicurus had for him. It comes through certainly in Lucretius's poem. It comes through in Diogenes of Oinoander that Epicurus was seen almost as a savior-like figure. And of course, Lucretius even compares him to being a godlike figure himself. So Epicurus is held in extremely high regard by his supporters. But I think it's very common today when people pick up Epicurus and they just get an initial understanding of what he's about to think that Epicurus is essentially a self-help author who is focused on happiness and that he's attempting to just tell us how to be happy. And that kind of a goal, I think, strikes most people as so uncontroversial that why would anybody have any problem with Epicurus at all if all he's talking about is how best to live happily? There are people out there, I guess, who have a goal of not living happily, but they're kind of few and far between who will overtly say that we should not try to be happy. Even in religion nowadays, the general implication is that you're wanting to be happy by following their particular religion. So it would seem like the goal of happiness is so uncontroversial that Epicurus should be just one of many people held in high regard throughout the history of Western philosophy. But that was not the case. From the Stoics to the Neoplatonists to the Christians to the Orthodox Jews, as they all saw something deeper and more threatening to their points of view than just a prescription for how to be happy. And that's something that people today, if they just go to Wikipedia, if they just get a superficial understanding, will not appreciate. When Epicurus came through and he rejected Platonism, he rejected the idealism of forms, he rejected the idea that there was a supernatural creator that started the universe in motion and that providentially attends to it as it continues. Those were, and they are, explosively divisive ideas. And people who take those positions, even today with variations of atheism, that is the kind of viewpoint on life that can get you exiled from your community very quickly if you express it at certain times and places that are not well advised. In fact, that's another scene from Alexander the Oracle Monger where an Epicurean attempted to challenge the fraudulent Alexander and almost got himself stoned to death because he was the only one who was doing it at that particular time. But the bottom line that I think DeWitt is stressing here is that there's more going on here than just how to live your life happily from moment to moment that you need to understand, because when you read commentators on Epicurus, they aren't generally taking a neutral position. They know where he's coming from in terms of religion. They know where he's coming from in terms of his positions on absolute morality versus contextual morality, and they know the explosive nature of his underlying presumptions.
I think we can maybe put a pin in that for just a moment by going back to what you cited as you started talking there, which was Alexander the Oracle Monger and Lucian's work to unsettle this fraud and charlatan from his position of wealth and power. And one thing he observed is that the behavior of Alexander and the people he was running with was to actually take Epicurus's works and burn them in the town square and then throw the ashes into the sea. So that encapsulates exactly what DeWitt is describing here. He's praised by Lucian and treated with utter contempt by Alexander. And anyone who reads that wonderfully written story will, I hope, know immediately which side to come down on. So that's a great place to start, and expresses very clearly what's going on here. And you have established, Cassius, the broader point, which is that Epicurean philosophy is not simply the sedate effort by one man to just make our lives a little bit happier or a little bit better. What it actually constitutes is a complete restructuring of the mental framework of how we should think about the most fundamental things, everything from nature itself to human societies, to the nature of the gods. This is a radical reformation, essentially, of thought at the time. And it's mostly because of that we have this interesting dichotomy between the people who absolutely love what he's doing, like Lucian, and the people who hate him as much as they hate anything. And that would be Alexander in this case.
And we'll post this to the episode thread as well. But one of DeWitt's first articles on Epicurus was entitled Philosophy for the Millions. And in that article, he sets out what you've just said there, Joshua, that Epicurus was in many respects leading sort of a reform movement. He was not just writing for a few friends inside some closed walls. He realized what he was doing. He was writing letters to people all across that area. He was writing articles and books against other philosophers. He was a campaigner for his viewpoints, and he thought it was important to teach about them and show other people what he thought he had discovered and what he thought was the right way to live. So in many respects, Epicurus have this missionary aspect, almost an evangelization type of an approach, that if you look around you and you see what you think is a world in misery due to improper beliefs about the nature of supernatural gods and improper beliefs about life after death and how you should live your life as a whole, you're going to want to express those views to your friends at the very least and to anybody who's interested and sympathetic to hearing about them. And you're not going to just keep it all to yourself as if it's some private secret of your own. Epicurus did not do that. Lucretius, Diogenes of Oinoander, what we know about a number of other Epicureans, they were engaged in spreading their viewpoints to other people. They were pamphleteers, as Cicero records. They were interested in spreading their viewpoint to other people in a friendly way. They thought they were correct about these things, but that is certainly one of the distinguishing factors of the philosophy, is that there's certainly no emphasis on force.
On that point about spreading their message and being pamphleteers, the next section is DeWitt's attempt to articulate the procedures by which the Epicureans formulated the philosophy and then ultimately came up with a system that they used to present it to other people. And this is where DeWitt gets his title for this chapter, which is A Synoptic View of Epicureanism. And I'm going to quote Henry David Thoreau's journal because I think it's on topic. Thoreau in his journal writes, "Many a man, when I tell him that I have been onto a mountain, asks if I took a glass with me," meaning a spyglass or a looking glass. "No doubt I could have seen further with a glass, and particular objects more distinctly, could have counted more meeting houses, but this has nothing to do with the peculiar beauty and grandeur of the view which an elevated position affords." And then we've got the important point. "It was not to see a few particular objects as if they were near at hand, as I had been accustomed to seeing them, that I ascended the mountain, but to see an infinite variety far and near in their relation to each other, thus reduced to a single picture." Cassius, I didn't get any input from you. Hopefully you agree that this is what I think it is, which is a good and very clear and concrete way of expressing what we mean by a synoptic view of the philosophy, which is what DeWitt in this chapter is about to give us. To see an infinite variety far and near in their relation to each other, thus reduced to a single picture. In fact, the word synoptic, which is Greek, has the prefix syn, S-Y-N, which means together or same or things along those lines. And then optic, of course, refers to the eyes or vision. So a synoptic view really means seeing things together. When you see things together, one thing that allows you to do is to see them in their proper relations to one another. And so this is going to impact the entire approach to how DeWitt is going to examine the philosophy.
Joshua, you didn't get any response from me while you were talking because I was agreeing with everything you said and I couldn't say it any better. I was not aware of that reference from Thoreau, but I think that is absolutely on point. You mentioned a moment ago that we were only on like the first page of this chapter, and I should mention that as we go forward. We're not necessarily planning on doing a chapter a week or anything like that. I'd like us to just spend as much time as we need to cover any particular point as much in detail as we think is appropriate. Because what you're saying is at the very top of what is page 4 of DeWitt's book, the issue of the synoptic view that you're talking about was something that's very important to Epicurus. This is not something that DeWitt just thought is a good idea. It is explicitly stated in the letter to Herodotus that we should use what amounts to outlines because we don't always need to know every detail of the philosophy or every detail of any particular subject, but we frequently need to know the important points of it. We need to be able to understand how the details fit together with the headings, with the major points. But there's no way that we can constantly refer in our minds every moment of our lives to every detail. We have to have a system in which we understand how things fit together and what the really important headings and categories of things are. That's what I'm reading into what Thoreau is saying here, is that the whole purpose of being up on the top of the mountain is not to see every little detail as if you were standing right next to it, but to take in the overall view of things and see how they all fit together. So I think that's a perfectly applicable and very good explanation of what DeWitt is attempting to do here and what Epicurus was recommending. And I think we've made this point privately in some of our discussions about the way we're going to organize this. But what DeWitt is saying here in this first chapter is that he's attempting to follow Epicurus's pattern. He's attempting to set out for us in this first chapter the broad outlines of what it's important for us to know about Epicurus. And then he's going to fill in those gaps as he paints it over time. It's almost as if you're assembling, I use the analogy of a robot, but I'm sure there's better ones. But if you're building a robot, you start with a skeleton and then you add things on top of it as you fill in the real substance of the robot or whatever you want to analogize it to. You build it over time, but you start with the fundamentals first. You don't just point out certain details and expect people to understand how they fit together. This would apply to what we understand to be the Epicurean criticism of Socrates, that Socrates would hide the ball. He would ask questions and never really answer them. He would point in particular directions and never give a clear answer to how someone should put them all together and form the big picture. And Epicurus took the opposite position. He's going to start out by telling you where he's going, what the important points are, and that's how you then know where the details fit in. It's the analogy that we've used frequently in the past between the map versus the terrain, or just simply acknowledging the difference between the forest and the trees. You can't see the forest if you stand 6 inches away from a particular tree and just stare at one trunk. You've got to stand back and appreciate how multiple trees can come together into an assembly of trees, which we label to be the forest. That itself raises all sorts of interesting questions in terms of, does the forest really exist, or is it just individual trees that exist? And it can be very confusing to think about how things fit together. What Epicurus chooses to do is to start out with the big picture and then, using the big picture, give you an understanding of how the individual objects fit together.
Maybe a small comment on the forest and tree analogy. Actually, you can argue the same about the tree. So if you get very close to the tree so that you don't see as it as a whole, you see then the bark, you see moss on the bark or something like this. And so you may not even consider an entity of a tree. Or even more confusing, if you go to sort of virgin forest where the fallen trees are just left. The new trees grow on the old tree. So is this now one tree, or how many trees? Is this the forest in itself? So that means even the word tree is already something higher order, something like an emergent property, which just exists by convention as an abstraction.
Great point. Great point. And that is what we're doing today, and for even several episodes, is we're not going to be diving into the specifics of whether an atom has an edge to it or not. We're not going to be looking at different aspects of images or any other of the more detailed applications of Epicurean philosophy. We're going to attempt to provide this overall general perspective on Epicurus by which people who are not so familiar with it, but who would like to understand where he's coming from, can see the big picture, not only the big picture of his own philosophy, but where he fits within the larger scheme of Greek philosophy and Western philosophy as a whole. So Joshua, you've mentioned one of the devices that DeWitt is going to use here with this book. He says that there's another device he's going to use that was important to Epicurus, was to establish an attitude towards a particular subject. That, for example, in starting out the authorized doctrines, the very first one is a reference to the attitude to be taken about the gods and how they're not to be feared and the reason why not to fear them. DeWitt says that, quote, if only the disciple could maintain this attitude, it was felt that he would be rightly disposed to receive subsequent instruction about the nature of the gods. And if the reader habituates himself from the outset to think of Epicurus as the most revered and most reviled of all ancient philosophers, he'll be rightly prepared to judge with impartiality the course of his life and the true structure of his doctrine. So there's an attitude issue involved here about Epicurus and about his philosophy that's important to understand from the very beginning. Epicurus seems to have been a friendly person who was well liked by those around him. He was not some kind of a oppressive personality who felt that he had been delivered the truth from the hand of God and he was just being the instrument of carrying down tablets from Mount Sinai to the rest of the world. He was the type person who it seems like you could relate to, who would be an attractive person to be talking to, friendly, supportive, and that's where this philosophy is coming from. It is not coming from a position that most of us are familiar with from religion. It's not a judgmental God like in the Old Testament. It's not a slash and burn and kill everybody who doesn't agree with you. It is a philosophy of explaining where it comes from, providing the reasons and the evidence for its position, and saying to you, hopefully you will understand and agree with this because we think it makes sense, but it's not something that is oppressive like supernatural religion tends to be.
Cassius, I was indulging one of my guilty habits, which is reading the Catholic Encyclopedia on New Advent. And in the page, which I don't have in front of me, but I can recall best I can, on Epicureanism, they start out by saying that Epicureanism has two meanings, and the modern meaning is gluttony. And it seems to me that they're using the same approach here, which is they're establishing an attitude at the beginning of what they have to say. Only in the case of the Catholic Encyclopedia, of course, they're trying to establish an attitude which will portray him in a bad light. And once you've grasped DeWitt's point here that the attitude that you take when you approach a subject, could be Epicureanism, could be anything, the attitude you take at the outset is going to color the way that your readers interpret the subject. And once you begin to notice this going on, you can notice at the very beginning whether a particular writer or speaker is hostile to the subject or not. And that's something that DeWitt's going to go into here. But the way DeWitt has started his book, I think, is a very interesting one and very good at putting things in a new and interesting light, a light that most people thinking about Epicureanism are not going to put it in those terms. In fact, I'll be honest with you, it wouldn't even have occurred to me to put it in these terms. So I think he's doing very good work here in starting out with his attitude issue. And he's right to say that this is important. It colors the whole view that you're taking of the subject.
Yeah, Joshua, that reminds me. Over the years, I know that I've relentlessly promoted this particular book as a really good place to start your study of Epicurus. And that's the reason for this, is that, as DeWitt is pointing out here, we don't even really have in our minds in the modern world an idea of what Epicurus was doing. Most people know something about pleasure. Like you say, he's now tagged with this idea that he was a glutton and a hedonist, and that all he was concerned about was immediate pleasure and sex, drugs, rock and roll, all the different types of slang terminology you can throw in his direction. And that's really all that most people know about Epicurus. And again, that's getting to be worse and worse of a problem as, I'm not here to condemn modern educational systems, but it seems to me that there's less and less time and emphasis placed on explaining Greek philosophy, our Western backgrounds in schools today, so that younger people are just not going to be exposed to this at all. And so a younger person who knows nothing about Epicurus, if for some unusual reason decide that they want to look into the subject and find out about him, what are 95% of the people like that going to do today? They're going to go to Google and they're going to put in the word Epicurus. And that's going to take them to the Wikipedia page. And the Wikipedia page is going to start from the very beginning that Epicurus and his followers were known for eating simple meals and discussing a wide range of philosophical subjects. And that the purpose of philosophy was to help people attain a happy, tranquil life characterized by ataraxia, peace and freedom from fear, and aponia, absence of pain. And he taught that people were best able to pursue philosophy by living a self-sufficient life surrounded by friends. So much of that is so unoffensive and obvious that most people would want those things for themselves. Who doesn't want happiness? Who doesn't want tranquility? Who doesn't want freedom from pain? Who doesn't want a self-sufficient life surrounded by friends? Who doesn't want freedom from the fear of death and those things like that? Those are such general goals that it seems unbelievable that anybody would ever have a negative thing to say about Epicurus at all. But of course, that's not the way things worked for 2,000 years in the development of the cultural understanding of Epicurus. It's not what he himself was likely focused on. Certainly, that was a large part of the ultimate understanding of what the goal was. But he was a real person. The Epicureans were real people just like us. They had a context in which they were living, and the context of that day was a set of philosophies that basically were not that much different than what we have today. Philosophy at that time taught that the universe was created by a supernatural God. Philosophy taught that that supernatural God was in control, that there was fate, that there was in many ways a deterministic aspect of life in which you were either fated to have a particular result or the gods would intervene to make sure that that particular result happened, and that good people go to heaven, bad people go to hell, and that the best way of life is just to be a good person, as if all those assertions were self-evidently true and that everybody understood what those things mean. One thing that people do understand today often is that Plato was associated with the idea of noble lies, but the general philosophy was intended to develop citizens who would be a part of the whole, and whether that's really true or not, philosophy was tied in with religion and some types of poetry, some types of literature, in which a lot of it was motivated by, frankly, manipulating people to be part of the existing system. And Epicurus was in the process of exploding the existing system by examining the foundations on which it was based and determining that their supernatural gods didn't exist, that there is no life after death to punish the wicked or reward the good, and that virtue, which all these other philosophers had been holding up as the way to live your life, has really no meaning at all without reference to a goal higher than virtue itself, which ultimately Epicurus determined to be found in nature through pleasure and pain, which are the guides that nature gives to live by.
Let me get in one more quote here from the Catholic Encyclopedia. This is the last sentence of their article on Epicureanism, and it says, "The whole philosophy may well be described in a trenchant phrase of Macaulay as the silliest and meanest of all systems of natural and moral philosophy." The point, I guess, that we're trying to make here, and of course we are going to reject entirely that line of reasoning about this, the point that we're trying to make in this whole introduction to the first chapter is that it matters where you start, that the first step is going to make a difference, we think. No Epicurean or no leader of the school in antiquity was going to draw up a list of books that you could not read. Of course, the Catholic Church itself did that, the Index of Prohibited Books. We don't have any record, I think, of Epicureanism or the early Epicureans trying to do that. In fact, the word that I think Cicero used was license, that the license which prevailed in the garden was so bad from his point of view that even a woman was able to read these books, this work by Theophrastus, and write an objection to it, write a response to it. So we chose this book as the place to start. And Cassius, as you said earlier, you've been recommending this book to people for a very long time because it matters where you start.
Because if we weren't starting with this book and the topics that we're looking at today, we might be doing the same thing that Wikipedia does and just jump immediately to the goal of life is pleasure. The highest pleasure is the absence of pain. And we would be looking at a very complicated and subtle set of doctrines in isolation from the rest of the philosophy. I'm really glad you quoted the Catholic Encyclopedia there, because that is certainly a great example of the revulsion with which people have treated Epicurus for 2,000 years. And that's why DeWitt is emphasizing that here, is because virtually all of the commentary, even today, the commentary that we read about Epicurus is largely written by people who don't agree with some of the major aspects of his philosophy, especially the morality. The idea of this license that you were citing from Cicero is still a major issue in discussion of Epicurus today. There's a general feeling among many people who are in religion and in certain types of humanism that we have to pursue the good as the ultimate goal. And that's why they don't like Epicurus, because Epicurus looked at that question of pursuing the good and said, well, we really don't know what it means to pursue the good. We don't know what the good is. To some extent, that's what Socrates was doing by challenging people to look at those foundations. But Epicurus, when he looked at those foundations, saw that ultimately to say virtue, to say the good, to say the will of God, things like that, those are generalities that have no meaning and have no ability to be defined in the real world through the evidence of the senses and through the logical approaches that Epicurus was pursuing. And once you cast those aside and realize that it's not a given what it is to be a good person, then Epicurus becomes the best guide for looking at those questions and going back to nature for the answers. The Stoics will say, let's go back to nature, and many other types of people will say, let's go back to nature. But unless you then go back to nature and take a position on whether nature was itself created by supernatural God, whether nature itself has these ideas floating around in it of virtue that have existed from the beginning of time, unless you take a position on those questions, you're not understanding the revolutionary nature of Epicurean philosophy.
The next point that he's going to make here is, from the point of view of logic, this progression from the general to the particular constituted a sort of chain argument. So that might be a good point to bring Martin in again, because logic is one of his areas of expertise.
Yeah, the whole issue of chain arguments and deductive reasoning from evidence and so forth is going to be a huge theme of Epicurean philosophy. So any comment on that, Martin?
That would go much more in detail than we want at this first pass in the overview.
Well, let me focus you on this, though. I think what Joshua's raised here that DeWitt is talking about is that Epicurus certainly uses chain reasoning, starting with a particular observation or evidence or position and extending that by these if this, then that kind of an object. And we don't need to go today into the difference between deductive logic versus inductive logic and so forth. But one of the points that's important to raise here is that Epicurus is often considered just to be all sensations are true and that we just go by the senses as if that's the only thing you need to know about Epicurean reasoning. We could just talk for a minute about the issue of the Epicurean canonics, they call it, his test of truth, in which the five senses, the anticipations, and the feelings are the basis of everything. But that doesn't bring understanding. Observation through the eyes doesn't tell you what it is you're observing. And Epicurus is not just some kind of an anti-intellectual, anti-logic philosopher who's telling you just to go with your feelings in every moment. He actually talks about the process of what do you do with these feelings and how do you translate your feelings and your observations into conclusions, into action, into opinions that you can have confidence in.
Roughly on this one. So DeWitt makes here some statements that Epicurus never declared sensation to be the source of knowledge. Okay, that's fine. Much less did he declare all sensations to be trustworthy. And this, at least in this formulation, the latter one, doesn't really seem correct. So at least Epicurus, I think that all sensations are true. And it's our interpretations of them which are not necessarily trustworthy.
Right. And when we get later into the book and we read some of the detail about that, I have to go ahead and bring up that that is a great example of one of DeWitt's strengths in explaining things, that there are various meanings of the statement, all sensations are true, various meanings and implications of the word true. And a very memorable analogy that DeWitt gives later in the book is to the example of a witness in court who is attempting to testify about something that they've observed. You know, they've sworn to tell the truth. And so what you ordinarily think about a witness is that if they're being honest, they're telling the truth. But when you think about it, you always have to understand that a witness only knows what it is they see. They only know what they observe from their own limited perspective, and that witnesses can make mistakes about what they observe. Their own opinions can be incorrect. They can be attempting to testify truthfully. They can be attempting to tell you something honestly, but they can still not give you the whole truth and nothing but the truth, as they say in court. DeWitt will go into much more detail about that later. But that would be the way superficial statements about whether Epicurus believes all sensations are true or not have to be understood. that all sensations are reported honestly. Your eyes do not have any intention to lie to you about anything that they're seeing. Your ears don't lie about what they hear. But because of distortions of all different types, what your eyes actually see at a particular moment may not be the clearest view of the thing that they're looking at. And you may have to take additional observations and compare all of those to determine which ones are the most repeatable and the most accurate before in your mind you come to a conclusion about what actually is true. I think that's what DeWitt is hinting at here, that certainly the senses are the foundation of all evidence that Epicurus considers to be correct. But weighing the evidence is actually a very different process than gathering the evidence. And DeWitt is saying you cannot just take the superficial view that all sensations are true and then stop your analysis. You have to understand that that's only a part of the picture. And that's an example of the sort of aggressive reading of Epicurus that everybody has to do, and which is, again, part of this attitude. That's what he said in the very first sentence about he's one of the most revered and the most reviled. So you've got to understand when you're reading somebody whether they're simply giving you a whitewashed version of Epicurus or whether they're giving you a blackwashed version of Epicurus, whether they're attacking him and putting him in the worst possible light, or whether they're giving you a fair representation of his position. The Catholic Encyclopedia, all these religionists who have attacked Epicurus for 2,000 years, Cicero, they were not motivated to explain Epicurus in the way that Epicurus would explain himself. And so they're going to cherry pick and take things out of context and use all sorts of other rhetorical devices to place Epicurus in a negative light. And when you read even historical sources like Cicero, it's going to be important to keep in mind where a particular person is coming from. And again, just like in a jury and a court system, consider the motivations and the perspective of the witness in understanding what they're telling you. Maybe that's one of the most important points of this approach to Epicurus is don't take what you read about Epicurus at face value. You can't even really take what you read from Epicurus at face value without knowing the context in which he was saying it and what he might be talking about. It really takes an aggressive reading and study of Epicurus to understand where he's coming from.
Because you raised that last point, Cassius, maybe we should talk a little bit about a quote by Philodemus that I don't have in front of me either, in which he says that the most appalling thing about the Epicureans in his day, I guess something to the effect of an appalling inattention to the books. And so Epicurus thought, and I think rightly, that a synoptic view was a way to present the philosophy with, as Thoreau was saying, as I quoted earlier, you take the whole thing in view. You're not going to start out by starting with one detail, because you'll have nowhere to put it. I noticed this when I studied history in college, that people think that history is you're just remembering dates and names. Well, in fact, that's far from being the point of a degree in history in college, and that's not what scholarship in history is doing. But if you don't have the framework of knowing, when we talk about the French Revolution, if you don't know the broader context of what's going on in that time, then describing something that happened there is not going to mean anything to you. So there is a necessary education in the broader context. Now, the problem that Philodemus is noticing is that the Epicureans in his time are taking the outlines, they're taking the epitomes, they're taking the synoptic view as being good enough, and then they're just moving on. So one of the reasons that the last 300 pages of this book were written was specifically so that we could fill out these details. And so that's another pitfall of the synoptic view. Nothing human is going to be perfect. And it requires diligence on the part of the reader to take what's being said in one place and compare it to things that are being said elsewhere.
Yeah, and Joshua, as you've made the point numbers of times in the past, Epicurus talks about how he gets his own greatest happiness from the study of nature. I think it would be wrong to presume that he's got a butterfly collection or a collection of birds or notes about aspects of the atom. I think he probably was looking at a much broader perspective of the study of nature, the study of human nature that we're talking about here, which means that you not only have to study the physical objects around you, but you have to understand your own thought processes. You have to understand your own sensations, your own organs of sense, the way they work. You have to understand the eyes, the ears, hearing, touch, taste, and the feelings of pleasure and pain. You have to devote a lot of thought to understanding what these things are and how they operate in order to use them successfully. So again, to make that point in just a slightly different way, when Epicurus says that we should study nature, I think he's talking about studying human nature, which is what we are talking about in this book. We're not just talking solely about the stars and the planets and the atoms and physical things like this. We're talking about the way our mind operates. And it's only when we come to an understanding of these things that I think we really get the benefit of Epicurean philosophy in full.
What we're essentially doing here by going through DeWitt is we're taking a synoptic view of the philosophy, which we, throughout the history of the podcast, have not really been doing. So I think you referred to it in one of the chats as a course correction.
Yes, as we begin to come to a close with today's episode, I think what we wanted to do in this first segment is to do what DeWitt has attempted to do here, to put a perspective on the general position of Epicurus, why he's significant, and some of the major pitfalls to avoid in the study of Epicurus, sort of producing a set of expectations that people should look for as they study Epicurus. In other words, I've heard so many times over the years when people start reading Epicurus that they were looking for practical advice on living more happily. And that certainly is a benefit that comes from the study of Epicurus after a time. But in order to get the real heart of where he's going and understand it and really be able to apply it, you need the structure as well, which is something that has to be dug out. Because in this book, DeWitt has attempted to provide what almost is a textbook of basic positions of Epicurus. There's not that many other such books out there like that, even through today. There are some generalist books, but most are very broad and go straight to the ethics, and they don't provide this type of sweeping background that DeWitt provides. So that's what we're going to be doing over the next several weeks as we go through the rest of his book. Martin, any closing thoughts?
This is a philosophy in the traditional sense, which was meant to be helpful on how to make life decisions, how to live.
Yes, what's the phrase about vain are the words of the philosopher, which does not
accomplish anything for the health of the soul.
Yes. Calasini, any general thoughts?
Yeah, I found this very interesting, this podcast today, and it highlighted for me how Epicureanism is a worldview that is almost somewhat between atheism and agnosticism, because we can read about how Epicurus says that the gods were not supernatural, and yet there is some element of the gods that he includes. It's a complete restructuring of how to think, because if God is not involved in people's lives, then that means there's a whole different vantage, a whole different way of thinking. And there's a kind of restructuring of how to think and how to view the world regarding what the place of humans within the world and life itself. So I think I much more thoroughly understand why Epicureanism was reviled. That word seems so harsh, but why it was reviled by people. Because I kind of jumped in from the place of the ethics and pleasure being the goal of life and it being a kind of way to create a happier life. But I hadn't really spent so much time thinking about these controversial aspects that come from when Epicurus was dealing with the competing philosophies of his time. But yet, even now, we still have some parallels. There are people who feel very strongly about how God is involved in the lives of humans, and yet there are others who are atheists. So this philosophy, it seems, is going to help provide a worldview that is much needed for people like myself. I have often thought that, well, maybe I'm atheist, and yet that worldview somehow hasn't fully met my needs. And so Epicureanism is something then that fulfills that need for me now.
That's a good reminder, Calasini. things you've just said are reflective of probably the target audience for this podcast. Again, as we said earlier, we're not targeting professional philosophers. We're trying to be as professional as we can and as accurate as we can in discussing these things. But we're not here just to provide more detailed information for people who've devoted their lives to studying philosophy. We're here to attempt to make practical use of Epicurean philosophy and to discuss it in a way that's useful to regular people who know that it's important to have a philosophy and know that these issues are important, but who in many cases have given up trying to understand basic aspects of Western philosophical teachings because there's just so much controversy and so much negativism that goes along with the general subject. You know, as you were talking, my eyes are still on the Wikipedia entry for Epicurus, and I see one sentence that says, quote, most knowledge of Epicurus' teachings come from later authors, particularly the biographer Diogenes Laertius, the Epicurean poet Lucretius, and the Epicurean philosopher Philodemus. And with hostile but largely accurate accounts by the Pyrrhonist philosopher Sextus Empiricus and the academic skeptic and statesman Cicero. And the words that catch my eye when it says the largely accurate accounts. Well, it's true that Sextus Empiricus and Cicero and many of these other philosophers at that time, it's clear from their writings that they were hostile. They disagreed with Epicurus. They believed in other philosophies and other positions, and they were writing in large part to refute Epicurus and to point out what they considered to be his errors. But even this Wikipedia article is taking the position, it's an opinion, that their viewpoints were, quote, largely accurate. And that's the difficult question in studying Epicurus. You have to decide for yourself whether what the enemies of Epicurus are saying is correct, or whether what they have done in relating Epicurus in a negative way is wrong. From their material, you can dig out truth, but you have to understand where people are coming from in writing and discussing Epicurus. That's the point that DeWitt has been making in this first chapter, and it's a theme that we'll continue to hit as we go through this series of podcasts. So, Joshua.
I'm stuck in a loop over here. I keep thinking about the synoptic view of the synoptic view. And what I'm thinking about right now is the trilogy or a series by Isaac Asimov called Foundation. And Cassius, you may have read this. I don't know if that'll be in your wheelhouse or not. But the premise, which I'll try not to spoil, is that we can save the galaxy by sending a group of people out to the edge of the galaxy to compile an encyclopedia on everything that we know. And as I think about that project, which anyone who's read that series will know how that turned out, I think about what we're doing here today, which is there's basically a couple points I really want to get across. And one of them is that the outlines and the synoptic view, the epitomes, these are no substitute for the details. But the corollary is also true. The details are no substitute for the epitomes and outlines. And finally, the ultimate point that I feel compelled to make is that neither the details nor the broader picture are any substitute at all for what really is going to turn out to matter. You need these for a foundation, of course, but it's all going to be just a fundamentally useless project unless you take that final step, which is to apply what you're learning, both from the epitomes and the outlines, from the synoptic view, and also from the particular details. Goes right back to what we were talking about at the very beginning of the episode, which is that the map is not the territory. And just sitting in your room staring at maps, I can make a reference here to The Lord of the Rings, because of course that's what ultimately got Bilbo Baggins out the front door of Bag End, is that the world is not in your maps and books, it's out there. And all of this is just a hobby or a minor interest unless you find ways to implement what you're learning and how you're learning it into every other part of your life.
Very much agree with what you just said, Joshua. I keep saying that some particular aspect is the really important point to stress here, and then we just come up with new points to stress. And when you talk about being in sort of a loop going back and forth, I think that's an interesting analogy too. There's so many things that you come back to this question of, does the tree exist? Does the forest exist? Is it only one of the two that exist? What does it mean to exist? You can get into an infinite loop of never really finding a resting place to analyze things. And I think that's where Epicurus was going, is that even though the sensations and the evidence of the senses are the data from which you assemble everything, the goal is ultimately to have an understanding. I would even cautiously relate this to our debates about kinetic versus katastematic and active pleasures versus resting pleasures and so forth. Ultimately, while we value the activities of life and the sensations and that those are the way we really experience life, you've got this sort of treadmill or this loop that unless you, through understanding, realize that it's not necessary to continue this treadmill into infinity and that there's nothing to fear about the end of life that comes through death, that there's nothing to fear about the absence of a supernatural God, you can't have confidence in your general attitude, your general approach to life. In the end, you've got this general assessment in your mind about the nature of your life and whether you're happy or not. Pleasures versus happiness is you can feel happy, but on the other hand, when you say happiness, you sort of imply a larger sum than just an individual set of pleasures. So there's no way to put everything into a master framework. There's no way to come to a global perspective on things without getting up to that 30,000 foot level or being at the top of the mountain that Thoreau was talking about and taking in an overview of the situation. The overview is not a threat. It does not deprecate the details, but the details don't deprecate the overview either. They're both true. They're both important. And if you don't have the overview, you're really just going to be like a rat in a maze looking at the wall that's in front of you and going from direction to direction. And if that's the trap that you're in, you can lose yourself to panic and anxiety, feelings of uselessness and hopelessness, nihilism. But if you get to a higher viewpoint of where your relationship is in nature, what your life is all about, then you can come to a feeling of tranquility or calmness and confidence in approaching the day-to-day events of life. And of course, this is not DeWitt's point. This is Epicurus' point and Herodotus. You don't always need the detailed analysis of the philosophy, but you always need the overview, the general assessment of things, the high-level view. And if you just jump into the ethics, if you just go to Wikipedia, you just read a few things about pleasure is the absence of pain, you're not going to get that overview, which will come through the study of Epicurus in detail. So, okay, unless somebody has something else, we'll leave it at that point for today and come back next week and continue on our overview of the philosophy of Epicurus. So thanks and bye.
Bye.
Bye.